He's Howard Eibach, former copywriter and creative director, and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 28 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about advertising, creative briefs, and briefing. Henry, we have Uri Baruchin back for a second time to continue the conversation we started a couple weeks ago. Let's join the conversation. Henry, we're back with another episode of the Brief Brothers, and returning after only a short time is our new friend, Uri Baruchin, all the way from London. He is a consulting strategist. We had a wonderful conversation going, and we had to stop it. Just, the reality of podcasting and life.
Ran out of time.
We ran out of time. But, we said we often have guests come back. Let's not wait very long. So we invited him back. I think it's only been a couple, 2-3 weeks. We had a great conversation started about your laments and your concerns about where our industry is going. And it was as Henry pointed out, it was a 40,000-foot question, which you couldn't answer in 25 words. So we didn't get into some of the great nuts and bolts of things that I know that you've written about and talked about. One of which was, and we can start here, I think, one of which was your concern about how frameworks have failed us.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean,
so
that's,
why don't you start there?
That's as good a point as any. And listen, I mean, first I want to thank you for inviting me back, and it's one of those rare opportunities to also like reflect and think if I'd like to do anything different or better. And definitely I want to try and be more focused. And also
you can teach us that. You can teach us that.
I guess less. I guess maybe less at times less ranty, because this isn't about blowing steam off for me, right? I mean, I do deeply believe that we can do better as an industry, and I actually like, I don't want to come across as one of the angry men of LinkedIn or something. I actually love helping clients and helping agencies get to answers and creative solutions. And I also, this was something I developed during the pandemic, but there was this whole talk I developed about how we can actually see strategy. And I guess the insight came through the pandemic, during the pandemic, because noticing questions around resilience, both organizational resilience and personal resilience, and realizing that I actually believe that being strategic and being strategic as a mindset is a form of both personal and organizational resilience. And you can see a lot of parallels, because you can't really be strategic without thinking about the future and being positive about that future, and staying, regulating your emotions on one side, but also staying connecting to them on the other side. And if you fail, you have to see it as helpful feedback. Otherwise, you're not being strategic. It's like fundamental requirements. So yeah, so I want to try and somehow positive things more positively.
Listen, I just want to interrupt and say I think you're being harsh on yourself. We really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah,
and that is a strategist thing to do, isn't it?
And that's why we had you back. It was just a matter of time limitation, and I wanted to delve into other issues that we were just like scratching the surface on. So, welcome back. I think the topic that Howard outlined was one we were definitely delving into, which was how frameworks have failed us. I think particularly as strategists within the advertising and branding community. And I want to follow that up when we're finished talking about that, about you made the distinction between branding and advertising several times. And I want to get into that a little.
And actually, I think there's a nice way to actually see what's connecting them and what's common between them around the issue of frameworks.
So the floor is yours, I think.
Okay. So I want to start by correcting a mistake I made last time, but that would kind of lead us to that subject. So I quoted Butterfield, and I had a bit of a slip. I quoted Butterfield saying that that good briefs. So the original quote is, he says, "Good briefs both direct and inspire." And for some reason, I said good ideas both direct and inspire, but good briefs both direct and inspire. And that is something that is true for both good briefs and good brand frameworks. Because at the end of the day, what both briefs and brand frameworks try to do is they try to capture the strategy, right? To capture the strategy and communicate it so the whole team can gather around it and understand what we're trying to do, and kind of like complete the connection between the client on one side and the creative team on the other side, with the hope of then continuing that connection to the audience. Now, when you think about that as a starting point, and that is one of the nice places where advertising and branding relate, it kind of leads us to pay attention to, I guess, to pay attention to what frameworks capture and what they don't capture. So what they choose to include in, and what they keep out. And then here's the interesting thing that you can notice very easily. You can notice it by Googling brand frameworks on Google Images, or going into any number of agencies who, not all agencies talk openly about their frameworks, because some of them treat it as some well-guarded secret, but when they do, you can pay attention to those things. And then if you look at those and you compare them to, I guess, and again, I'm not an academic, so this is my impression from my body of knowledge. It's kind of like the top 3 influential frameworks historically. So that would probably be Keller, Acker, and in Europe, which will be also known in the US. And in Europe, you will have Capra as well. Now, because frameworks are by nature visual, and we're on a podcast here, I'm not going to start talking about the different labels and the different parts. I'm going to try and make generalizations, and then the more curious of our listeners can kind of like run those names and find those things quite easily. And I'm very happy to send you some links for the show note, so people can have a look at some good introductions to those frameworks that exist online, not by me, by the way, but they can do it. So what's common between all those models is that they are not just about the identity, right? They don't just try to explain, this is what the brand is about, this is the personality of the brand, or the brief equivalent of that would be, this is the key message, this is what the proposition is, those kind of things. And by the way, I do think that the single-minded proposition in a brief, which Howard wrote a whole book about, am I correct? I'm not confusing with someone else, Howard, right?
Yes.
And I read that book a couple of years ago and really liked it.
My new best friend. You're
Yeah,
my new
no,
best
you
friend.
didn't ask me to say that. That is of my own volition. So those ideas are useful, and those things are important, and the identity of the brand is also important. But if you look at those frameworks, let's call them, I would say those are probably the top 3 most influential ones and those then shaped, right? Because then agencies came in. My suspicion is, because this is even a little bit, some of that is a little bit before my time, my suspicion is they've tried working with some of them. They realize some of them are quite complex to work with, and they've tried replacing some of them or simplifying them to a way that clients can understand more easily, and that teams can understand more easily, and are easier to work with and easier to sell. And this is where things start, you know, mutating is usually the analogy I use. Because those original frameworks have the identity and messaging side, but also they have aspects that talk about the market and the organization and the audience that are much more multifaceted than the common frameworks that are being used today. If you compare them with the current taxonomy, most frameworks out there belong to one of two families. I call those families the pyramids and the templates. The pyramids are quite influenced by the classic brand pyramid and by Keller's pyramid, and they kind of go from they start with more tangible attributes and they ladder up. And we know that functional benefits, emotional benefits, they ladder up to some kind of an idea. And sometimes that idea would be called purpose or all sorts of other things. But they go from tangible to intangible. That's one family. And the other family is the template that basically give you a list of things to define about the brand. And this is where things sometimes get out of hand, where you have, vision, mission, values, purpose, promise, positioning, statement, story, narrative, manifesto, etc., etc. So there is the problem of proliferation and economy. But I actually think that the more fundamental problem we're seeing here is that the frameworks that focus on what's easy for people to understand and easy to work with clients in workshop, they overemphasize the messaging and identity. So they start disconnecting from the actual problem and the actual strategy. And for me, that is the cardinal sin of brand agencies, right? It's the cardinal sin. It's basically that they have over-lionized, over-heroed that identity side over things that belong. So eventually, after a couple of rounds, that has led to the current reality we live in, where people confuse the articulation of the strategy with the actual strategy. Now that confusion is built into how brand strategy works, because the confusing things about brand strategy is that brand strategy, if simplifying it extremely, tells you if you want to achieve this positioning, or if you want to fulfill those business goals and those targets you have in the market, tell this story, have that personality. That's what will unlock the category for you, open up people's hearts and minds for you, right? That's the sales pitch of brand strategy.
The articulation is something
the articulation
different.
is important, right? The articulation is important, but unless you keep that connection, yeah, unless you keep that connection to the actual strategy, to what you're actually trying, to the how we win, right? We mentioned where to play and how to win. So if you disconnect the definition of your brand or the idea of your campaign from where are we playing and how are we trying to win, this is where things get fluffy. Like we said last time, this is where things get kind of like very hard to define and understand, and also test if they're working or not working. But this is where things start being less and less strategic. And for me, that is a great shame. It's a great shame, because that's the whole point of it.
So why do you think that it's happened? I think you alluded to it a little bit. And is it just that it's too dense and complex for the types of people that we have working on both the agency and the client side? Is it too boring to get into the homework?
Well,
and it's
I mean, I don't think it's boring.
It's more sexy to focus on the output.
So it's not boring. I don't think it's boring, but I do think there's a bit of a this kind of like vicious circle between agencies trying to make the overall theories more sellable and simplify them on one hand, and on the other hand you have clients that actually need agencies to be more strategic, right? They need the agencies to be more strategic, but their patience, because of, you know, the world is becoming faster and faster, so clients' needs are actually on the up, but their patience is on the down. So what you actually need to do, what I do, is I try and minimize trying to kind of like educate them or sharing the full frameworks with them, or kind of like I show my workings, but I turn my workings into what I hope is a compelling, simple story and argument. I take away the scaffolding, if you will. I take away the scaffolding. The issue is, if I'm a brand consultancy in a competitive market, I want to seem sophisticated. I know my role is to simplify, but I want that simplification to look, it's tempting to want that simplification to look as if it requires some sort of rocket science. And it's not rocket science, guys. It's not rocket science. Let's be honest with ourselves. It's actually about simplicity, a lot of it about common sense and business sense, right? So common sense is sometimes wrong. That's the beauty of strategy. Sometimes you need to follow common sense and sometimes you need to question it. But it's not rocket science. So then, because you want to appear sophisticated, what you're actually doing is you're dumbing down the frameworks, but making it look as if there's still some clever stuff behind it. And then you create that vicious cycle with the client who is starting to lose faith in you, which leads us to today's situation where clients are starting to take strategy back from agencies.
Uri, we've talked with Bob Hoffman a number of times, and I've read a bunch of his books, and his latest book is called The 3-Word Brief. And one of the things he says in the book is great advertising is the best strategy.
Yeah.
How does that thought fit into what you're talking about here?
You know what? I have no issue, because I think I know what he's trying to say. I mean, Hoffman is a great wit, and as a great wit, it's sometimes tempting to give up some of the accuracy in order to communicate better. It's also why he's probably so much more successful than me, right? Right? Because
I get it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, but the question, great strategy is great advertising is the best strategy. But strategy helps you get there, I think, if you do it properly. I'm really against strategy taking over the whole process. I'm absolutely against that. I don't think that's how creative development works. I think when strategy becomes over-directive and over-rigid, it can ruin everything. What I do think strategy is good at is pointing to the opportunity spaces that need to be explored creatively, right? If we think, it's one of the most useful metaphors I know, is if we think of it as a treasure hunt, right? We're searching for gold in the Klondike. By the way, that's not my metaphor. That's from Perkins, who has a theory about breakthrough thinking that we will not go into, but I can give it in the links for the show notes. But we are, we're searching the markets for those pockets of gold, right? The most fundamental idea of strategy is the use of strength against weakness, or if you want, finding some kind of an advantage and focusing on the greatest opportunity. I think I'm paraphrasing Rummold. Again, you will notice I'm doing something quite rare in this industry. I do not pretend that ideas that are not my own are my own. I have come across not a single agency that does that. All agencies, when they bring the most fundamental ideas of our industry to clients, they always pretend as if it came
They
out of
invented it.
nowhere,
Yeah, they
or their
invented it.
twist about it is what makes it work. But okay, that's an aside. So what I believe is that strategy is good at pointing to those opportunity spaces. Creativity loves a clever constraint, right? That's what briefs do. They
Give
kind
me
of
the
constrain
freedom
you.
of a tightly written brief.
Yeah, the freedom of a tightly written brief. I don't think I don't,
Liberating constraint is the concept.
yeah. And I don't think Hoffman would argue with that.
No. Well, the thing about Bob is, I mean, I will also quote H.L. Mencken, who, and I'll paraphrase him. He said, "For every complex problem, there's a simple solution, and it's wrong."
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean,
I've-
Bob is clever. He is absolutely clever, and he can reduce complex ideas into very simple explanations, which is,
No, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan.
yeah. But I mean, we had a little disagreement. I said, there's no such, you're not going to give a 3-word brief to a creative department and expect them to actually
Yeah,
execute.
no, I
It
think
was
that's
because,
more of a metaphor,
yeah,
honestly.
exactly. And it was because we hadn't defined our terms. So that got clarified very quickly. But the point is still valid. I mean,
So I
his
think,
argument,
I would
yeah,
argue that that's what you just said was that we didn't define our terms. That's what we're talking about here.
yeah,
Basically, essentially, is everybody has an idea in their mind of what this thing is supposed to be, and they use words that other people use to mean other things and so there's no common ground with regard to all of these practitioners in this business that we call communications, advertising, marketing, um, that so it's all just up for interpretation. And then there's also the issue of the quality of the personnel touching the work, and also the batting back and forth. So there was a time, and this is my interpretation of the history of advertising and how it relates to marketing is, and maybe I'm wrong, but the way I understood it is, 100 years ago, companies made stuff and that was their core competency. They made and sold stuff to wholesalers, and they didn't know much about consumers. And ad agencies began something called a marketing department within the ad agency, where they began to focus on consumers. And then what happened as our clients became these big public corporations, they brought all of that in house. But somehow the ad agency still has to interface with those marketers, and so you have marketers on both sides, the strategists at the agency and then the marketers on the client side. And again, I don't know that I think that most of the times that a client engages an agency and there's never a come to Jesus meeting at the beginning of that relationship where they say, this is what we mean when we say these things. And
yeah.
we expect you to understand that this is what we mean when we say these things, instead of
You mean
leaving.
clients don't do it, or the agency doesn't do it?
I don't think it's
Either
happening.
one.
I don't think it's
Kind of like
happening.
establishing a joint vocabulary.
A joint vocabulary. Also,
Yeah.
I've said
No, I
this
mean, it's
also.
actually something I sometimes do, but okay.
I've
Yeah.
also said they don't establish a joint vision on
Yeah.
what the role of creativity should be for that particular account.
Right.
Like everybody says, oh yeah, we want a creative ad agency, but what do you think is creative? What do you think is disruptive? Like all these words that we use that
Yeah.
become fluff to use.
So I want to try and sort of connect that a little bit to the 3-word brief, because while I don't think he literally means
No,
a
he didn't.
3-word brief,
No,
I
we
do
get
think
that. Yeah.
what would be kind of like, if I'm offering some kind of like, a unified theory of those contradictions, but I think good briefs are hourglass shaped, right? They kind of like they very succinctly paint some sort of a broad picture. They boil that down to what Howard would usually call the SMP, and Hoffman can call his 3-word brief. But there has to be some sort of a central driving idea that then helps, and I think that's where maybe even I would appease even Feldwick.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Paul would disagree with that, but
Yeah. I would appease Feldwick, but then then our hourglass reopens again because you want the exploration to be quite free, to go broad again, right? And that's how human thinking works, right? It's basically from divergent to convergent to divergent again, and it goes on and on like that in a loop, and you can actually identify that loop in going on to the next campaign, right? Because what are you going to do the next time? You're going to look at your broad campaign with all the different executions and ideas and activations and experience and whatever, and you're going to ask yourself, if this was a success, what were the things that made that success? So you're starting to boil it down again. So you're constantly going in those divergence, convergence, divergence, as opposed to the stereotype that strategists are convergent thinking people and creative people are the divergent thinking people. That is a binary, right? But like every binary, what's useful is finding out what happens between the two ends of the binary.
and Uri, isn't that also contradicted by the fact that strategists and creatives don't or shouldn't, and the best ones are collaborating with each other, are not working separately?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I had a discussion with Ed Su some months ago, who is a strategist in New York. In response to, we invited him on the show to talk about an article he'd written on, I think it was Substack, which was titled "The Brief is Dead." And one of his arguments was that the old school approach, and this is, I never experienced this, but he said this is standard operating, and you can confirm this or not. But he said the old school approach, where the strategist writes the brief, hands it off to the creative department, and disappears, is dead.
Yeah, but this is a classic case of rewriting history to make an argument. Because if you look at the agencies that we celebrate were born out of collaboration. Not always a collaboration between a strategist and a creative, but those things were always working together. I don't think, I don't think there was ever this kind of like pure thing where, the strategists, the planners work separately, alone. No one lets anyone from the creative team talk to the client. Yes, there used to be more hierarchy, and I'm notorious for bringing in juniors with me to meet the client, and some agencies liked that tendency more. Agencies I worked in, some of them liked it more and embraced it, and some of them said no. And usually I just make sure that there's balance between how many people from the client side are in the room and how many people from the agency are in the room. But overall, I like giving teams that sort of exposure to the client, to the actual product, factory tours. A lot of those things have gotten lost a little bit because of how time works, how condensed everything has become. The fact that people now expect a planner quite often to turn a client brief into a creative brief, by the next day. So can you blame them that what they do now is they cut and paste that brief into ChatGPT and say, please translate that client brief into a creative brief?
Yeah.
Right.
And
so
with perilous and deadly results.
But also, that's the sad state of things on the advertising side. Things are not much better with what happens with brand strategy processes, because one of the things that happens is that clients have this sort of fatigue, right? They've been listening for unconvincing stuff for so long that they kind of go, just show us the creative, right? Just show us the creative, and then we'll decide if we like it or if we don't like it. But when it comes to brand strategy process, there's this certain fatigue because you're taking them through a process that many of them have done multiple times, and they already know that it has very little impact of what then happens. So you start getting a lot of skepticism and cynicism, and it just, the level of it's so ironic that, you know, what has happened, the digital revolution and globalization have removed friction from the market. They let things happen faster. And then the tolerance for any kind of friction becomes much lower. But what do? We end up doing things that are making friction worse, and the tolerance for that becomes even worse because
I'm
we can't
reminded.
keep up. Because we
I'm
can't
remind.
keep up.
I'm reminded of one of the slides that Henry and I saw when Peter Paul von Wheeler and Matt Davies came on the show to talk about their survey. That I think we talked about it when you were here last time, Uri, from Better Briefs. They surveyed marketers and agencies to
Yeah.
compare their approaches to how clear are the briefs are that the marketers provide to the agencies. And the one slide that really struck me, I mean, they all did, but one in particular was that, and help me out here, Henry, if I'm getting this wrong. I think it was that 60% of marketers admitted that they use the creative process to figure out the strategy.
Yeah.
So it was, I mean, when you said that this friction has been removed and clients have heard so many
No.
things.
What I'm saying is that friction has reduced in the market, but increased in the process.
Well, I think maybe it was prior to that where you said that clients have heard us or agencies say so many things about how the process works that they just say, throw up their hands and say, well, just show me the creative, which I think it probably
exactly.
it produces this reversed engineering or the reversal of what it should be. I'm going to see the creative and figure out the strategy after I see the creative, rather than let's have the strategy first, and then we'll develop the creative from that.
Now,
I will.
the interesting thing for me always when I come into a new process is that there are always so many talented, smart people involved. Now, as a strategist, I'm often asked to come in when things are hopelessly stuck, or at least people feel like things are stuck and we need some sort of a breakthrough, right? That is kind of like, I mean, there are many other scenarios where when I'm called in, I'm not some kind of, I don't know, troubleshooter, full-time troubleshooter. But this is one of the typical situations. And I think that one of the first things that I do is I come into it with it's an approach that is called appreciative inquiry that was drilled into me by one of my mentors at some point in my career. Is you have to assume people have been trying their best all along, even if things now are confused and the last couple of campaigns have not performed yet, and when people who are a little bit creative and have seen good advertising in their lives look at it, they think, what is this, assume that actually people were meaning well, they were trying their best. And I find it super educating to then try and unpick, looking at the bad brief. I mean, client briefs. I mean, the sad thing is that by now, a lot of client briefs are as bad as the creative briefs that follow them. But I like to look at those bad briefs and ask myself, what is the actual thinking that was before this brief came in and got it wrong and distorted it? Or what is the nugget of truth that is still here? When we look at this mountain of research that the client just dumped on my table, the case is always that you get different vintages, and some of them are better than others. I think Grace Kite told me that kind of like vintage analogy, but I'm not sure. Maybe it was someone else. Could be someone from Cantor. But the point is, you will notice clients keep asking themselves the same questions, taking them into research again and again and again. one of the questions I love asking in client interviews is, from all the research you shared with me, what surprised you the most? Or what do you think is the one most useful discovery or an interesting thing? You'd be surprised how rarely there is such a thing. Most of the time clients say, well, I mean, after you help them maybe kind of like say it, but they say, well, the research mostly confirmed our hypothesis, which is a very important role for research. But it means you can actually now move on with more confidence. So why aren't you as confident as the researcher was supposed to make you? Anyway, I've digressed again. Right. Ask me another question. Sorry.
We started to talk a little bit, or you mentioned early on in our conversation last time, your thoughts on the get to buy brief. And
Yeah,
I'd like
right.
to, and I'd like to, and I'd like to hear your, I mean, one of the reasons why I do not teach that, and I, as you know, I teach brief writing in my workshops. And one of the reasons I do not use that format, and I don't teach to a template. I teach the thinking about what goes into the template. But one of the reasons I don't use the to get to buy is because from my perspective, it's very sophisticated, very
Yeah,
hard
yeah,
to do, and very easy to
yeah,
get it wrong. Could you
yeah.
elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, so that's a really interesting thing. So the first red flag is when you see people calling it get to buy rather than get who to buy,
Ooh,
right?
true, right.
Because this is a sign that someone can like plucked the consumer and any sort of insight out of the framework for no reason, because this is part of the original framework. There's only one thing worse than that, and I swear that that has happened to me with more than one agency. With students, it happens all the time because maybe they weren't paying attention. But I've seen agencies do that, which is instead of buy by, they spell the buy buy.
Who
So
says
so so but
we don't
but
have a
so
sense of
here's
humor?
so here's here's the there's a built-in flaw if you use that framework badly. And the built-in flaw is that what you'll get is some sort of a fluffy series of sentences that when you reduce them, what they essentially say is get our audience to like our brand by demonstrating that it's a great brand. Now, what I've just said is devoid of strategy. That is a
And,
logical loop, right?
and creatives would be completely lost with that. Like,
Yeah,
what am I
that
supposed
is
to
a
do with that?
that is a logical loop. But a lot of even some get who to buys out there, but definitely most of get to buys out there are this sort of loop. Now, at best, that means that often, at best, what you get out of that tool is a paraphrasing of the client brief, right? Because the client, on some level, because I still expect and my clients give it to me, right? Clients still have so much knowledge about the audience and the product and all the audience that you should really drink, drink thirstily from your clients in order to understand how you can help them and what the solution is. But what would happen is that you would reduce and you will end up with a reductive client brief, let's call it that, right? You will end up with a reductive client brief that basically says, we have an audience and we want you to make them do this. That's not a creative brief. That is not a creative brief. But that is also not the intention of the original framework. The original framework came from an agency, right? It's not, I think BBDO, right? Originally, that framework comes from. I hope I'm not confusing BBH or BBDO. It's one of the other, or the other. I mean, Baiba did the full archaeology of that one. But the framework came from an agency. And the way it was supposed to be used, and Baiba also published like an interview with one of the creators of that framework. They never meant that to be, here's our way to simplify the client brief so it's short and the team can understand it, because that's not enough, right? I mentioned opportunity spaces. That is the goal of the brief. The goal of the brief is to point the creative. I often say is that the measure of a good strategist is pointing the creative team in the right direction, then getting the fuck out of the way. Right? I just said the F word, and before I was
you can't say
embarrassed
fuck on
to say
our,
shit.
no, you can't say fuck
So
on our,
inconsistent.
You can't fucking say that.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.